I've been reading this book, New York Times bestseller, about two men, two of probably the greatest living peacemakers of our time, two men who are dear friends who unconditionally love each other, represent two of our world's great religions. In 2015, April of 2015, these two men met to talk about a subject that has surprisingly close ties to this idea of peacemaking that we're talking about this winter. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who we talked about last week, and the Dalai Lama got together in Dharamsala, India, a place where the Dalai Lama lives, to celebrate the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday, and also to have a week of interviews to lay the groundwork for this new book that they're going to be publishing through Random House on the subject of joy. It's called The Book of Joy. And it's interesting because you would ask what joy has to do with global peacemaking. And there's no question that everybody who meets either one of these men, one of the first things they're always struck by is this deep, abiding, bubbling over kind of joy that each of them has deep down in their hearts. And it's unmistakable that every time these two men get together, the joy that comes out of it is explosive and contagious and infectious, and people who are around them are overwhelmed by this deep, abiding joy that the two of them share. From the moment they got together, Tutu landed at the airport. The Dalai Lama usually doesn't leave his residence because they have to close down the entire town and everything stops whenever he leaves his residence. But he came out to meet Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and even on the tarmac, you could see this deep affection and silliness, this deep joy that was a part of their life. And throughout this entire week, people around them were just overwhelmed by the joy of these two men as they laughed together, as they teased and made fun of each other, as they acted silly together, and even against the Dalai Lama's teachings, they boogied together. It was an amazing week. And of course, the first question that people would ask is, how could the two of you, two men who have been through so much suffering and so much pain and so much heartbreak in your own personal lives, how could you be people who have this much joy? The Dalai Lama was born in 1935. His name Lamo Dandram, to two peasant farmers in a small little hill town up in the Himalayas in Tibet. And when Lama was only 2 years old, a small group of monks came to his village and came to his parents' house and told his parents that it had been revealed to him that their 2-year-old son was the 14th reincarnation of the semi-divine being Bodhisattva, who is the divine enlightenment of compassion. And that he had been called by God to be the leader of their country and the keeper of their faith. And these monks took him at 2 years old away from his parents and brought him to Lhasa, to the famous Patala Palace, there up in the capital city of Lhasa, 1,000 rooms in this palace where he was isolated away, taught by a small group of monks and trained so that on his 4th birthday, he could be wrapped in crimson robes and enthroned as the 14th Dalai Lama. His name was changed to Tenzin Gyatso, which means oceans of wisdom, and that is where he lived. And he says throughout the time, that he felt very lonely. He isn't shy to say that he felt lonely and cut off from his people, from his parents, from everybody. After that, when he was 15 years old in 1950, 80,000 Chinese soldiers marched into the sovereign, peace-loving nation of Tibet and started murdering their people and committing terrible atrocities in the name of trying to liberate Tibet. At 15 years old, the Dalai Lama found that he was the undisputed leader of 6 million people and in a full-on war with an army that was over 100 times larger than his. For the next 9 years, the Dalai Lama tried to negotiate with Chairman Mao in China, but there was nothing that was making things any better. When he was 24 years old, in 1959, 30,000 of his fellow countrymen came and surrounded his palace because they thought that he was likely to be attacked. And the Dalai Lama could see that this was just a recipe for an absolute bloodbath. And so he made the hardest decision of his life. And on one night in 1959, he disguised himself as a soldier and he snuck out of the palace in the dead of night and sent himself into self-exile. He spent 2 weeks climbing over the Himalayas through 19,000-foot passes, through sandstorms and snowstorms, and finally arrived in India where he asked for asylum and he was allowed to stay as an exile in this mountain town of Dharamsala. It was there that he lived and went around the world trying to promote peace and justice, not just for his small country of Tibet, but for the entire world. Now, it's interesting because when the two of them are asked how it is at all possible, how it's possible that these two men who had seen so much pain and so much suffering were able to remain joyful, they said it's actually quite easy. They both agreed very strongly on this one point, that true joy has very little to do with what's going on around you, with the turmoil that's happening around you. They said that joy is very different from happiness. Happiness is about our external circumstances and what's happening in our lives at any given point or time. He says that happiness is very much what its root says, that it has to do with the happenings in our lives. But they both say that joy is something much deeper and more permanent and more stable. It has to do with a state of being or a state of mind. It has to do with the way that we understand ourselves and our lives and our world and our value in the world. They both say that joy is something very different. And as we look through the scriptures, as we look into the Bible, we find that the Bible has this very same idea. It's very different from the way that we typically think of joy. Throughout the Bible, where we see joy talked about the most is in the midst of some of the most horrible circumstances. And so the book of Philippians, written by the Apostle Paul, we call it the joy book because in 4 short chapters, Paul either uses the word joy or rejoice 14 separate times. And yet, when Paul was writing this, he was in a Roman prison awaiting a death sentence. And yet still, he was able to write this. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Nehemiah, when he arrived back to Israel with the exiled Jews to find that their entire city had been destroyed and burnt down to the ground, all of Israel was weeping. But this is what Nehemiah said. Nehemiah said, "Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks, and send some to those who have nothing prepared. This day is holy to our Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." And again, on the night before Jesus was crucified, when he knew he was about to be portrayed and about to go through the most horrific death, he wrote these words. "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. For greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus, Nehemiah, Paul, Tutu, the Dalai Lama, they all agree that there's something more to joy than just the things that are happening around us. The Dalai Lama says that our joy has much more to do with the things that are going on deep down under the surface, things that are very unaffected by what's happening around us in our immediate surroundings. When Yvette and I were studying for our dive masters in scuba diving over in the South China Sea, we went out every single day for 7 weeks to go scuba diving. And some of those days, there would be terrible conditions in the ocean. There'd be storms, and the clouds would be dark, and the waves would be pitching and rolling, and there'd be these huge swells and waves crashing over the boat, and we'd have to get down into the water in this. And we'd get in the water, and all we could hear is this loud roar of the fury all around us, and waves would be crashing over our heads, and we'd be swept back and forth. And sometimes we felt like we weren't going to survive it, but every single time, as soon as we took that regulator and put it in our mouth and started to sink down beneath the surface, we never had to go more than 5 or 10 feet under the surface of the ocean before the roar of the wind and the waves would disappear. The crazy cacophony and fury of what was going on the surface would just completely sink away as we sunk into this tranquil, calm cocoon that was these calm seas. The Dalai Lama says that this is what it's like to have joy in your life. The storms might be raging on the surface, but inside, in your inner being, you can be joyful and be completely at peace. The next question they're asked, which you can imagine, is, well, so how do we obtain this kind of inner peace, this kind of deep and inner joy? And although they have slightly different takes on it, there are a few things that both Tutu and the Dalai Lama agreed upon completely. And the first was that in order to have this kind of joy in your heart, you need to understand that you are deeply loved and completely accepted and absolutely valued. The Dalai Lama said that until we can understand just how loved we are, how deeply loved we are, we'll never be able to obtain this inner joy or this inner peace. Tutu put it this way. He just said, discovering more joy does not, I am sorry to say, save us from the inevitability of hardship and heartbreak. In fact, we may cry more easily, but we will laugh more easily too. Perhaps we are just more alive. Yet as we discover more joy, we can face suffering in a way that ennobles rather than embitters. We have hardship without becoming hard. We have heartbreak without becoming broken. When Tutu was asked to lead this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he said, there's no way. I'm not the right person. This is much too big a task for me. And they convinced him to do it. And so he did. And on the very first day, a man was giving a testimony about how he had been tortured by the police during the apartheid regime. And halfway through, the man couldn't continue on. His chin began to quiver and he started to cry. And immediately, Tutu burst out in tears. He started to bawl and to sob, and he couldn't get control of himself. At the end of the day, when they got together with the leaders of the commission, he said, I told you so. I told you I was the wrong one to do this. I'm a crybaby. I feel way too deeply. I can't do this. You can't let me be the leader of this. But before long, they all started to realize that it was precisely because he felt so deeply That because he felt deep joy and deep sorrow, because he felt both his own pain and joy, and because he felt the pain and joy of others, that was exactly what they needed at that moment in their history as they tried to bring true healing and true global peacemaking to that country in South Africa. I remember when I was 15 years old and I became a Christian, I was sitting on that hillside in Hilltop, Maryland, and it was like the whole world came to life. I felt like all of the stars became that much brighter, and suddenly I had this feeling like I was connected to and loved everyone on the face of the earth. It was the most amazing feeling. I came back from that weekend like I was floating 5 feet off the ground, and I remember coming home that night, turning on the television, and seeing one of those commercials. A commercial I had seen thousands of times before. It was probably for UNICEF or Compassion International, but it was one of those commercials with the little boy in Africa with the distended belly and the flies climbing around on his face, and I had seen it so many times before, and it never really affected me. But this day, I burst out crying for the first time when I looked at that commercial. It was this sweet, sad, joyful connection that I felt with people. Our little boy, Clay, we watched a movie on Friday night called Pete's Dragon. Has anybody seen this new Pete's Dragon? A couple of you have kids, grandkids? Adorable story, this incredibly affectionate tale of this relationship between this dragon and this boy, but at the very end they have to say goodbye so the boy can go and have a human family and the dragon can go and find his family. But when they were saying goodbye to each other, all of a sudden Clay, our little boy, burst out in tears, and he began to bawl and sob like more than we had ever seen him before. It was absolutely uncontrollable, and so we were holding him and trying to console him and comfort him. At the same time, my heart was smiling. Because when we are able to know how deeply we are loved, and when we're able to let go of our self-focus and focus on others and their pain and their joy, it plants the seeds of a deep, abiding joy inside of our lives that is not dependent on circumstances, that's there through thick and thin, that becomes the seeds of an inner peace, which becomes the seeds of global peace around the world. This is what the Dalai Lama and Tutu also agreed on. They said the next thing that is a part of inner joy is taking your focus off of yourself. Becoming less self-absorbed, as the Dalai Lama put it. You know, they're doing a lot of studies right now in our country on happiness and joy and how to attain it and why it's so elusive, especially in the United States. And one of the things that they've found is that depression is 10 times more prevalent today than it was in the 1960s. 10 times more prevalent. And they are finding that the average age of onset for depression in the 1960s was 29 and a half years old. You want to know what it is today? 14 and a half years old. Isn't that horrible? And they're trying to figure out what's going on and what's happening. And one of the things that the researchers are discovering is that there is this incredible connection, this link that seems to go hand in hand through the years, that the more self-absorbed and self-focused our society becomes, the more individualistic we've become through the years, there's been a corresponding rise in the amount of depression. More studies have shown that people, the more self-focused a person is, the less happy they are. The more fearful they are, the more insecure they are, and the more distrusting they are. The Dalai Lama says the cure is to meditate and to focus and to pay attention to our connection to not just all of humanity, but to every living thing around the earth. But the more connected we are, the more joyful we are. And finally, the two of them said, and both agreed, that the final thing that we can do to be more joyful in our lives is to serve others in generous acts of compassion and generosity. When I was in Houston, I heard about a woman who had been suffering from a deep, debilitating depression. And it was getting worse and worse, and she was going to a psychiatrist and trying all sorts of therapies, but nothing was working, and she was just getting more detached and more withdrawn, and she wasn't leaving her home, and it was completely paralyzing her life. And her psychiatrist had tried everything, and finally he was about to give up, and he said, "Can we just try one more kind of crazy thing that's a little out of the box?" And she said, "Of course, I would crawl hands and knees across the Mojave Desert if I thought it would make any difference." And he said, "This weekend, Habitat for Humanity is doing a build over in the next town. Would you be willing to go on Saturday and to volunteer a little bit of your time to go and help build a house for Habitat for Humanity?" And she said, "Look, I'd try anything. Of course I'd try." He said, "And then come back next week and let's talk about how it went." So the next week, she comes for her appointment, and the first thing he notices is that she's like floating 6 inches off the ground as she comes into his office. He has never seen her look like this before. She's amazing. She seems joyful. She seems together. She seems to have purpose in what she's doing. She's looking him directly in the eye. He said, "It must have gone well." She said, "It's the most amazing thing I've ever done in my life. From the moment I set foot on that work site, it was like all of my depression just melted away. I have never felt so important, so valued, so well used in my entire life. I met the family that we were building for, and I heard about the things that they had been through, and suddenly I felt so unbelievably grateful for all of the blessings in my life." She said, "I've never felt so connected to people. I've never felt so good about myself. I've never felt this good in years." And the psychiatrist said, "Well, hallelujah. I think we've discovered your cure. What I want you to do, here is your prescription. I want you to spend a few hours, whether it's Habitat for Humanity or serving food at the rescue mission, whatever it is, once a week, I want you to spend a couple of hours serving other people." And the woman said, "Are you crazy? I don't have time for that." We spend so much of our time and energy searching after happiness, don't we? And we always think that it's going to be the next thing, that if I can just get that car or get that person to date me, or if I can just get that promotion or make this much money or buy that house, then I'll be happy. And it happens on a global scale too. Don't ever make any mistakes about it. If we can just annex this country next to us, if we can just defeat that enemy, if we can just get this much respect on the global stage, then we'll be happy. And yet we all know that when we get that house or we buy that car, we get to that salary we've been looking at, when we annex that Crimea or wherever it is, the happiness is short-lived, right? We don't need experts to tell us, but they do tell us. They've studied this and they tell us over and over again. We know it full well that when we achieve those things, they make us happy for a little bit, but it's fleeting and it quickly dissipates and goes away, and we are left once again with that solid baseline, that permanent level of joy that we have fostered and cultivated deep down inside. Something goes great and we have a little bump, but then it always comes back to that level. And that level has nothing to do with what's going on in your life, but has everything to do with how loved you feel that you are, how accepted and valuable and forgiven. It has everything to do with the degree that you've made a choice to take the focus off of yourself and put it onto your connection with all living things and all of humanity. It has everything to do with the degree that you've decided to go out and serve others in acts of generosity and compassion. The Dalai Lama puts it this way. He says that pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice. There are a lot of crazy things going on around us right now in our world, aren't there? And what I want you to spend this week thinking about is, to what degree even in the midst of it all, are you choosing joy? Amen. You know, it's interesting that every